There's something unusual about the internet in that we treat it as very permanent, when in fact it's anything but, or more particularly the various facets of it, the assets that are exposed, are anything but. The infrastructure of the internet is relatively stable. Despite its relatively hierarchical design, there are a lot of people and a lot of protocols in place to make sure that it stays active. And in a way, the fundamentals of how we get online have not changed much in a couple of decades. We're more likely to use Wi-Fi now than an Ethernet cable, but it still relies on that same modem and router. We use a lot of data from apps on our phones that we otherwise used to get by specifically downloading a file on our desktops to view. But it's really the same formula of connecting, browsing, downloading. It just looks a bit different. We might not think about it, but what really has changed is the content we access. And I don't mean that we access more streaming media and less text, or more messages of one kind or another and fewer emails. That much is obviously true, but also not that interesting or different. It's just a new form of an old pattern. What has changed is the actual content. For instance, have you ever saved an indie song to your library on Spotify, and then when you come back, it's disappeared, grayed out, so you can't listen to it? Or have you bookmarked an article online to come back to later, and when you return, you just get a 404? The actual content that we see comes and goes so fast and relies on so fragile a mechanism that it's almost absurdly transient. All it takes for that Spotify song to disappear is a small change in the licensing rights of a record label. All it takes for that article to give you a 404 is for someone to decide to change their site's organizational system so that every URL is now slightly different. And all it takes for your data on someone's site or service to go down is for a system administrator to press the wrong combination of keys, or for that service to decide that it's going to pivot, focus in a new direction. One server powers down, another powers up, and your data is history. You might think, well, the cloud will fix that. But little data oopsies happen all the time. Things can break in cloud infrastructure and cascade. Then too, a bad query that deletes data can happen on a virtual server cluster just as much as on a physical server. Articles, songs on Spotify, shows on Netflix, services, apps, entire websites, they can all fade away pretty fast if you're not paying attention. It's all thoroughly temporary. Of course, physical structures and institutions are impermanent too. How many shops, stores, or even companies, businesses exist from just a couple centuries in the past? Some do exist, with a few even older than that, but most entities decline after a few decades, or at most a century or so. But somehow, even for a small store that spans only a couple of decades, as the years pass, we become used to its presence. We're shocked and maybe dismayed when it closes its doors. It was, in our subconscious view, permanent. That's all the more so true for long-term businesses that seem to have withstood the test of time, only to now prove that they too must eventually fail. A little bit of the edge is taken off when we hear of an acquisition rather than a shuttering of doors. When some internet-based service gets acquired, Service X is now Service Y. It's annoying, but it's an understandable transition. It's much less understandable if we try to go onto an old account and find that not only is the account gone, but maybe the site's gone, and all records of everything we've done there went away years ago when someone disconnected a server after that small company went bankrupt or somebody stopped offering that free service. But that's really the kicker. How often do we ever face this? How often do we actually need to confront the loss of a service that we use? It happens, but more often we hear it about newer things than older things. For instance, Google trying out a new service that they want to offer and later discarding it for lack of popularity, for example. But the long-term standbys that really kick you in the teeth, those don't come up much because we don't use much of anything long-term. There are, of course, exceptions. Many of us have a favorite account with some site or some app that we've kept on using regularly for years and years and that we can't imagine letting go of. But that's one or two out of how many? How many services, sites, email clients, applications do we register for online just like that? Hardly a thought. And then we lose track of it? It's practically endless. And so really when we face our digital lives, as firm and real as it can sometimes appear, not only is it dynamic and ever-changing, but it is actually very temporary. Its form is constantly shifting. The matter that composes it is constantly shifting. And the faith that we place in it is typically misplaced. That doesn't mean we shouldn't appreciate it, doesn't mean we shouldn't make good use of it. But it does mean that we should not treat it as an undercurrent of our lives. It is not fundamental and permanent. It is something transient and temporary. And inasmuch as you recognize that the store that you pass by walking down the street won't be there forever, much more so should you realize that nothing on the internet is permanent. No site, no service, no app, certainly no post, no video, no comment. The implication of this is not to take it too seriously. Words can change lives, all the more so when the words and images that we see come from what we now recognize as one of the most important conduits for information in our lives. This portal through which we, in one form or another, constantly receive an understanding of the world. But it all just lives on a handful of boxes, sitting in various server farms. It is all in some way unreal. The implications that it has, the impacts that it can have on our lives are real, but only if we communally make them real. Someone can read a comment, become angry, happy, depressed, confused. Someone can read an article and decide to go take action based on what they've learned and do something in the real world. The songs playing over Spotify can inspire you on your morning jog. These effects are real, but the real only through our own perception of them. And if we take them just a bit too seriously, we forget that they do just live in a little box somewhere, and we forget that we can shut them away. The more pervasive the internet becomes in our lives, and the more benefit it gives to our lives in very real ways, the more we need to counterbalance this with an understanding of context. Taking a good hard look at where these very temporary artifacts stand in the span of your life, of human history can be transformational to how we approach our interaction with the digital world.